When justice protects power instead of people, silence becomes policy, and truth becomes a threat. Greetings, I'm Richard Wolff. Today we're not just talking headlines, we're analyzing the systems, the scandals, and the truths behind the news. Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin by confronting a simple but deeply uncomfortable truth. When power investigates itself, justice is usually the first casualty. Today we are asked to look once again at the Jeffrey Epstein case, not as a scandal of the past, but as a mirror reflecting the structural failures of the American justice system. A survivor has now stepped forward, pulling back the curtain on what many suspected all along, that the Department of Justice under Donald Trump did not merely fail in its investigation of Epstein, it protected a system that benefits from silence. The survivor's account does not describe a justice system that stumbled, it reveals one that stepped carefully around danger. The failure of the Epstein investigation under the Trump-era Department of Justice was not the product of missing evidence, lack of legal tools, or public ignorance. It unfolded in full view inside institutions staffed by experienced prosecutors who understood exactly what they were doing. That is the uncomfortable hook at the center of this story. When the system failed, it failed by design. Decisions were made about which leads to pursue, which witnesses to prioritize, and which doors were better left unopened. These choices were not neutral acts of bureaucracy, they were exercises of power. In any serious criminal investigation, momentum matters. Evidence must be followed quickly, testimony preserved, and pressure sustained. Yet, in the Epstein case, momentum repeatedly evaporated at critical moments. Files remained sealed, lines of inquiry slowed, and the scope of accountability narrowed. This pattern is not random. Prosecutors are trained to understand risk, and in this case, the greatest risk was not losing the case. It was winning it too broadly. A fully pursued investigation threatened to expose networks far larger than a single defendant, networks intertwined with finance, politics, and prestige. The safest institutional response was restraint disguised as procedure. What makes this failure systemic is that no single rogue actor is required. The Department of Justice operates through incentives, career calculations, and political signals. Under the Trump administration, the DOJ projected toughness on crime while quietly practicing caution where elite interests were involved. That contradiction is not an anomaly. It is a feature of a system in which political leadership shapes priorities from the top down. When prosecutors sense that certain outcomes are unwelcome, the law does not need to be broken. It merely needs to be interpreted narrowly. The survivor's testimony punctures the myth that justice fails only when laws are weak. The laws were sufficient. The authority was present. The resources existed. What was missing was institutional will. This is where the story becomes larger than Epstein. A justice system that claims independence but responds to power signals is not independent at all. It becomes a risk management apparatus, measuring reputational damage rather than pursuing truth. That is the hook the survivor forces into the public conversation. Justice did not stop because it could not proceed. It stopped because proceeding was inconvenient. There is also a deeper lesson about how accountability is quietly managed in high-profile cases. Delays are framed as due process. Silence is framed as professionalism. Secrecy is framed as legal necessity. Each step appears defensible in isolation, yet together they produce a predictable outcome. Public attention fades, pressure dissipates, and the system survives unchanged. This is not failure as collapse. It is failure as containment. When institutions behave this way, they protect themselves first and the public second. The Epstein investigation under Trump's DOJ shows how easily the language of law can be used to shield power from scrutiny. The survivor did not merely expose a flawed investigation. She exposed a governing logic in which justice is selectively applied, carefully paced, and ultimately subordinated to the stability of elite structures. That is why this moment matters, and that is why the failure cannot be dismissed as an error. It must be recognized as a choice. The Epstein case forces us to confront a reality that many prefer to avoid. In modern politics, wealth is not merely economic power, it is legal power. The survivor's account exposes how financial influence and political proximity can bend the justice system without ever visibly breaking it. This is the central hook. No laws had to be rewritten, no dramatic interventions were required. The system adjusted itself naturally to protect those who mattered most. Epstein's fortune and his access to powerful circles did not sit outside the investigation. They shaped its boundaries from the very beginning. In theory, justice is blind. In practice, it is acutely aware of status. Epstein was not treated as an ordinary defendant because he was not embedded in ordinary social networks. He moved in spaces where money intersects with policymaking, philanthropy, media ownership, and political careers. That kind of access functions as armor. It creates hesitation among prosecutors, caution among investigators, and silence among institutions that rely, directly or indirectly, on the same elite ecosystem. The investigation was constrained not by evidence, but by fear of consequence. What makes this dynamic especially dangerous is that it operates invisibly. There is no written memo instructing prosecutors to go easy on the wealthy. Instead, there are career incentives, reputational calculations, and unspoken understandings. Pursue this too aggressively and doors may close. Law firms may become unavailable. Political futures may be jeopardized. This is how power polices itself. The survivor's testimony highlights not just who escaped scrutiny, but how predictably that escape unfolded. The presence of wealth also alters the public narrative. High-powered legal teams, strategic public relations campaigns, and media influence work together to reshape perception. Questions become complex, timelines become unclear, and accountability becomes premature. The story shifts away from victims and toward technicalities. This is another hook of the Epstein case. While survivors struggled to be heard, the machinery of influence worked overtime to soften outrage and delay reckoning. Justice slowed down, not because it was careful, but because slowing down served powerful interests. Political influence further deepened this protection. Epstein's associations crossed party lines, reinforcing a bipartisan reluctance to fully expose the scope of the crimes. When political elites share donors, social spaces, and institutional interests, accountability becomes a mutual threat. The Trump-era DOJ operated within this reality. Aggressively pursuing the case risked implicating individuals connected to power centers that extend far beyond one administration. The safer option was containment, not confrontation. This case also reveals how inequality reproduces itself through the legal system. For ordinary defendants, the system moves swiftly and harshly. For the wealthy, it becomes procedural, cautious, and endlessly patient. The survivor's experience underscores a brutal truth. Access to justice in the United States is deeply stratified. Wealth does not guarantee innocence, but it dramatically increases the odds of evading consequences. The real scandal is not that Epstein had powerful friends, it is that the justice system responded exactly as such a system is designed to respond under extreme inequality. When wealth concentrates, so does influence over outcomes that are supposed to be impartial. The survivor's voice cuts through the illusion that this was an aberration. It was a demonstration of how political and financial power quietly reshapes accountability, leaving victims to carry the burden of truth while elites remain insulated from its consequences. The survivor's experience reveals a justice system that demands extraordinary courage from victims while offering them remarkably little protection in return. From the moment survivors come forward, they are placed in an adversarial environment that tests endurance rather than truth. The hook here is stark. Speaking out is treated as an act of bravery, yet the system responds as if bravery were a substitute for justice. Delays, procedural obstacles, and institutional indifference become part of the process, quietly shifting the burden from the accused onto those already harmed. In the Epstein case, survivors were not met with urgency proportional to the severity of the crimes. Instead, their testimonies were filtered, postponed, and in some cases effectively sidelined. This marginalization was not always explicit. It appeared in the form of postponed hearings, limited communication, and investigations that seemed to lose focus over time. Each delay sent a clear signal, even if unintentionally. Your pain is acknowledged rhetorically, but it is not a priority operationally. For survivors, this creates a second trauma, one inflicted not by an individual, but by an institution claiming to represent justice. The system's treatment of survivors also reflects a deeper imbalance of credibility. Wealthy defendants are assumed to deserve meticulous caution, while victims are expected to prove not only what happened, but their own reliability, consistency, and emotional restraint. The survivor who spoke out against the failed Epstein investigation did so in a context where disbelief is often the default. This is the hook that unsettles public confidence. When victims must fight to be believed, the justice system is no longer a neutral arbiter. It becomes a gatekeeper of suffering. Another layer of marginalization lies in how survivor narratives are managed. Legal processes tend to fragment testimony, reducing lived experiences to isolated facts and timelines. While this may serve procedural clarity, it strips away context and humanity. In the Epstein investigation, this fragmentation worked to the advantage of delay and minimization. Survivors' voices were heard in pieces, never allowed to form a complete and urgent picture that demanded action. What should have been overwhelming evidence instead became manageable inconvenience. There is also a political cost to being a survivor in a high-profile case. Public scrutiny, media exposure, and online hostility create powerful disincentives to speak out. Survivors are aware that coming forward may define them publicly in ways they cannot control. When institutions fail to deliver accountability after survivors take these risks, the message to others is chilling. Silence may be safer than truth. This is not a failure of individual empathy. It is a systemic failure that shapes behavior long before anyone enters a courtroom. The Epstein case illustrates how marginalization is reinforced through exhaustion. Justice is not denied outright. It is delayed until hope weakens. Survivors are asked to relive trauma repeatedly, often with little indication that progress is being made. Over time, attrition replaces resolution. This slow erosion of resolve is one of the system's most effective and least visible tools. What emerges from the survivor's testimony is not simply a story of neglect, but a warning. A justice system that sidelines victims while protecting its own stability teaches a dangerous lesson about whose voices matter. When survivors must fight for attention in cases involving powerful figures, justice becomes conditional and dignity becomes negotiable. The marginalization of survivors in the Epstein investigation was not incidental. It was an outcome produced by a system more comfortable managing reputational risk than confronting uncomfortable truths. The handling of the Epstein investigation did more than fail a group of survivors. It weakened public faith in the very institutions meant to uphold democratic accountability. The hook is unavoidable. When justice appears selective, trust collapses quickly and spreads its damage far beyond a single case. For many citizens, the Epstein saga confirmed a suspicion they had long carried, that the rule of law functions differently depending on who you are and whom you know. Once that belief takes hold, institutions lose not just credibility but legitimacy. Trust in the Department of Justice depends on the perception that it operates independently of politics and power. The Trump-era response to the Epstein case shattered that perception for a significant portion of the public. The absence of transparency, the lack of comprehensive accountability, and the perception of quiet restraint created an information vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed skepticism, anger, and conspiracy. When institutions fail to explain themselves convincingly, people do not stop asking questions. They stop believing the answers. This erosion of trust has consequences that extend well beyond one administration. A justice system seen as protecting elites invites disengagement from democratic processes. Voters become cynical, assuming outcomes are predetermined. Legal rulings are viewed not as reasoned judgments, but as political calculations. The Epstein case became a symbol, a shorthand for the idea that powerful individuals exist above the law. That symbolism matters because politics is not driven by facts alone, but by shared beliefs about fairness and accountability. Another hook lies in how institutional silence amplifies suspicion. When authorities decline to release information information or delay action without clear justification, they unintentionally validate the public's worst assumptions. The Epstein investigation was marked by long periods of quiet, during which official narratives failed to keep pace with public concern. Each unanswered question deepened the sense that something was being hidden. Even for those inclined to trust institutions, the lack of clarity made confidence difficult to sustain. The crisis of trust also reshaped media dynamics. Traditional outlets struggled to maintain authority as alternative narratives gained traction online. In the absence of decisive institutional action, speculation filled the gap. This was not merely a media failure, it was a governance failure. Institutions that rely on public confidence must actively maintain it. When they retreat into procedural language and closed-door decision-making, they surrender the narrative to doubt. The implications for democratic stability are profound. A society that believes justice is selectively enforced becomes more polarized, more suspicious, and less willing to accept outcomes it dislikes. The Epstein case and the DOJ's handling of it reinforce the idea that accountability is negotiable. That perception does not remain confined to criminal justice. It bleeds into elections, policymaking, and civic engagement. When people believe the system is rigged, they either withdraw or radicalize. What makes this moment especially dangerous is its cumulative effect. Trust, once lost, is not easily restored. Each high-profile failure compounds the last, creating a feedback loop of disillusionment. The Epstein investigation did not create skepticism toward U.S. institutions, but it intensified it. It provided a concrete example that critics could point to, not as theory, but as lived reality. The survivor's testimony reignited attention because it cut through institutional abstraction. It reminded the public that behind the legal maneuvers and political calculations are real people harmed by systemic failure. When institutions appear indifferent to that human cost, their moral authority erodes. The crisis exposed by the Epstein case is not temporary or partisan. It is a warning that without transparency, accountability, and equal application of the law, public trust will continue to decay, leaving democratic institutions hollowed out from within. In closing, the Epstein investigation is not over simply because the headlines moved on. It lives on in the survivor's voice, in the unanswered questions, and in the structural rot it exposes. Until we build institutions that are independent of wealth and power, until justice is insulated from politics and profit, we will continue to witness the same cycle: scandal, outrage, silence, and repetition. The survivor has spoken. The real question now is whether the rest of us are willing to listen, and more importantly, whether we are willing to change the system that made this failure inevitable.